Welcome back, my friend. Before tonight's story begins, take a quiet moment for yourself. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let tonight's quiet journey begin. Far below the ocean, deeper than any light has ever reached, there are places where entire worlds quietly come to life, not from sunlight, not from the surface, but from heat rising slowly out of the earth itself. Creatures gather there, they grow, they live in a world completely hidden from everything above. And then, without warning, that world begins to fade. The warmth disappears, the life drifts away, and in the end, nothing remains but silence. Tonight, we're not exploring the surface of the ocean. We're drifting downward into a place where life begins without light and ends so quietly, almost no one ever notices. Where the ocean floor opens. If we return once more to the deep ocean, allowing ourselves to descend slowly through the quiet layers beneath the surface, something begins to feel different. Not immediately, not in a way that draws attention, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, until the stillness we have come to recognize begins to carry something else within it, a sense that the ocean floor is not as still as it appears. If we pause here for a moment, just above the seafloor, everything seems calm, flat, silent, a wide expanse of sediment, resting undisturbed. Nothing moves, nothing changes, and yet, this quiet surface is only the outermost layer of something far more active. Far below, beyond what we can see, the earth is slowly shifting, not suddenly, not violently, but continuously. The ocean floor is part of a much larger system, a thin outer layer that rests above immense heat and pressure, and over long periods of time, that layer does not remain fixed. It moves, it bends, it adjusts. If we remain here just a little longer, allowing time to pass in the slow way it does at this depth, something begins to change. Not all at once, not in a single moment, but in a gradual unfolding. Deep beneath the seafloor, heat rises, pressure builds, and the rock that once seemed solid begins to respond, not breaking apart suddenly, but softening, shifting, creating small weaknesses that did not exist before. If we could watch this process over time, it would not look like an event. It would look like patience, a slow preparation, a quiet rearrangement of forces that have always been present, and eventually, those forces find a way through. A fracture forms, not as a dramatic opening, but as a subtle separation, a narrow pathway where the structure of the earth gives way just enough to allow something from below to rise. If we remain here, the first signs are almost impossible to notice. The water above the fracture behaves slightly differently. A faint distortion, a subtle movement that does not match the surrounding stillness. Then, slowly, something begins to emerge. Warmth, not intense, not sudden, but present, carried gently upward through the water. And with that warmth, something else follows. Minerals, dissolved elements, tiny particles, drawn from deep within the Earth's interior. If we remain here, allowing this process to continue, the flow becomes more consistent. The fracture stabilizes, The pathway remains open, and what was once only a subtle change begins to take form. The surrounding environment starts to shift. The chemistry of the water changes. The balance that once defined this section of the ocean floor begins to adjust, and within that adjustment, something new begins to take shape. If we move slightly closer, there is still very little to see. No large structures, no visible movement, only a faint, rising presence. And yet, this is the beginning, not of something dramatic, but of something sustained. Because where energy exists, even in small amounts, life has the potential to follow. If we remain here just a little longer, that process begins quietly. Microorganisms, too small to be seen, begin to gather, not because they are searching, not because they are aware, but because the conditions allow them to remain. The warmth, the chemicals, the steady flow, all of it creates a place where something can exist that could not exist here before. If we allow ourselves to step back slightly, the pattern becomes clearer. What was once an empty stretch of seafloor is no longer the same. It is changing, not in a way that disrupts the ocean, but in a way that quietly transforms a single point within it. A new source of energy has appeared, and around that source, the first stages of a system begin to form. If we remain here, the process continues without interruption. The flow strengthens, the opening becomes more defined, the surrounding area adapts to the new conditions, and slowly, over time, the vent begins to take shape, not as a fixed structure, but as an active point, a place where the earth and the ocean meet in a continuous exchange. If we follow that exchange, even briefly, something becomes clear. The vent is not separate from the ocean. It is part of it, a temporary expression of deeper forces that have always been present. And because those forces continue, the vent continues. If we remain here just a little longer, the idea begins to settle. This place was not always here. It did not exist until the conditions allowed it to form. And even now, as it begins to grow, it is still changing, still adjusting, still becoming something more defined. If we allow ourselves to follow this process further, the question begins to shift, not whether the vent exists, but how it continues, how it develops, how something so small, so quiet, can become a place where entire systems of life will eventually gather. If we remain here, the answer is not immediate. It does not arrive as a sudden change. It unfolds slowly, patiently, just as everything does at this depth. The opening widens, the flow strengthens, the conditions stabilize, and what began as a subtle fracture becomes something more consistent, more present, more capable of supporting what comes next. If we allow ourselves to stay here for one final moment, the beginning becomes complete. The vent has not fully formed, but it has begun, and that beginning is enough. Because in the deep ocean, nothing needs to happen quickly. Nothing needs to rush. Everything continues at the pace it has always known. Slow, steady, unseen. And from that quiet beginning, something larger will grow. The growth of a vent system. If we remain here just a little longer, allowing the newly formed opening in the ocean floor to continue without interruption, something begins to take shape, not suddenly, not in a way that draws attention, but gradually, as though the ocean itself is adjusting to what has quietly begun. The flow from below continues, warm, steady, unbroken. At first, it remains subtle, a faint rise of mineral-rich water, barely visible against the surrounding darkness. But over time, that flow becomes more consistent, more present, and with that consistency, the environment begins to change. If we look closely now, the water around the opening no longer behaves like the rest of the ocean floor. It moves differently, not faster, not stronger, but with a quiet direction, a slow, continuous rise that does not stop. And within that movement, something begins to gather. Particles, minerals, tiny fragments carried upward from deep within the earth. If we remain here, watching without expectation, those particles begin to settle, not all at once, not in a fixed pattern, but gradually, layer by layer, each moment adding something small, something almost invisible on its own. And yet, over time, those small additions begin to create form, a slight elevation, a faint structure rising from the seafloor. At first, it is difficult to distinguish from the surrounding sediment, but as the flow continues, the structure becomes more defined, more stable. If we drift a little closer, the change becomes clearer. The vent is no longer just an opening. It is becoming a place, a point where the movement from below meets the stillness above. And where that meeting continues, something begins to build. If we remain here, the process does not rush. It does not accelerate. It follows the same quiet rhythm we have come to recognize. The flow rises, particles settle, structure forms, then continues again and again. If we allow ourselves to follow this rhythm, something becomes easier. There is no need to track every change, no need to observe each layer, because the process does not depend on observation. It continues on its own. If we remain here just a little longer, the structure grows slightly taller, not dramatically, not in a way that interrupts the stillness, but enough to become noticeable. A chimney-like form rising slowly, formed entirely from what the earth releases and the ocean allows to settle. If we step back, allowing the scene to widen, the vent begins to feel more complete, not finished, not fixed, but present, a stable source of energy, a place where the conditions have shifted enough to support what comes next. If we remain here, something else begins to appear, not immediately visible, not defined, but present in a different way. Life begins to respond. At first, it is almost impossible to detect. Microorganisms gather along the surface of the growing structure. They do not move quickly. They do not spread suddenly. They remain because the conditions allow them to. If we look more closely, their presence begins to change the surface itself. Subtle layers, thin films that form along the mineral structure, quiet signs that something has begun. If we remain here, the pattern continues. The vent grows. The flow remains steady. The microorganisms gather, each part continuing without interruption, each part depending on the same quiet balance. If we allow ourselves to stay within this process, something becomes clear. The growth of the vent is not separate from the growth of life. They happen together, each one shaping the other. The structure provides a place. The energy provides a source, and life responds by remaining. If we drift slightly outward, The surrounding ocean remains unchanged, dark, still, endless. But at the center of this stillness, the vent continues, a small but persistent presence. If we return our attention to the vent, its form becomes more defined over time. The chimney rises slightly higher. The flow becomes more visible, not brighter, not louder, but more consistent, more certain. If we remain here, the idea of growth begins to soften. It is not expansion in the way we might expect. It is not rapid. It is not forceful. It is simply continuation, a steady accumulation of small changes, each one building upon the last. If we allow that idea to settle, the process becomes easier to follow. Nothing is added that is not supported. Nothing grows beyond what the environment allows. Everything remains within balance. If we remain here just a little longer, the system begins to feel complete, not finished, but stable, a place where energy rises, structure forms, and life begins to gather, all within the same quiet rhythm. If we follow that rhythm, even briefly, something begins to ease. There is no need to move ahead, no need to anticipate what comes next, because what is happening now is enough. The vent continues, the structure grows, life gathers, all at the same slow, steady pace. If we remain here, the movement becomes less important. The stillness becomes more present, and within that stillness, the entire system continues, uninterrupted. If we allow ourselves to rest within that continuation, even for a moment, something settles. The idea that growth must be visible begins to fade. The idea that change must be noticeable softens, because here, growth happens quietly, slowly, without needing to be seen. If we remain here just a little longer, the scene becomes simpler, less detail, less distinction, only a gentle awareness of something continuing. The vent remains, the flow continues, life gathers, and everything stays within the limits that allow it to remain. If we allow that to settle fully, the growth becomes complete, not as an ending, but as a state, a quiet balance where everything that has begun can continue softly, steadily, without interruption. When a vent becomes a world, if we remain here just a little longer, allowing the structure of the vent to continue without interruption, something begins to change again. Not in the flow, not in the shape, but in what gathers around it. Until now, the vent has been forming, growing, becoming stable enough to remain. But as that stability settles in, something else begins to follow. Not quickly, not suddenly, but gradually. Life begins to arrive in forms that are easier to notice. If we look closely now, the surface of the vent is no longer only mineral. It carries something softer, something layered, a thin presence that spreads slowly along the structure. At first, it is difficult to distinguish, barely visible against the surrounding darkness. But as time passes, it becomes more defined, more consistent, a living surface forming where none existed before. If we remain here, allowing that change to continue, the area around the vent begins to feel different, not just as a structure, but as a place, a center, a point where multiple processes come together. The flow from below, the structure that has formed, and now the presence of life. If we drift slightly closer, more details begin to appear. Small organisms conditions attach themselves to the vent. They do not move quickly. They do not spread in sudden patterns. They remain anchored, positioned where the conditions allow them to exist. If we remain here, their presence increases slowly. One becomes many, not in a way that fills the space, but in a way that changes its texture. The vent is no longer a solitary structure. It is becoming part of something larger. If we step back, allowing the scene to widen, the transformation becomes clearer. What was once an isolated opening in the ocean floor is now a gathering point, not crowded, not chaotic, but quietly active. Each organism existing within its own small space, each one aligned with the same source of energy. If we remain here just a little longer, the system begins to feel complete, not because it has reached an endpoint, but because all the necessary parts are now present. Energy, structure, life, all continuing together. If we follow a single organism, its movement is minimal, a slight adjustment, then stillness. It does not search widely. It does not move far. It remains close to the vent because the energy it depends on exists here. If we look again, others behave in the same way. No sudden movement, no rapid expansion, only presence, a quiet continuation of life that does not extend beyond what the environment allows. If we remain here, something deeper begins to settle. This place is no longer defined by the vent alone. It is defined by the relationships that have formed around it. The flow provides energy. The structure provides a surface. Life gathers where those two meet, and together they create something stable. If we drift slightly outward, the surrounding ocean remains unchanged, dark, still empty. But as we return our attention to the vent, the contrast becomes clear. Here, something continues, something persists. If we remain here just a little longer, the system becomes easier to understand, not as a collection of separate parts, but as a single, connected presence. Each organism depends on the same source. Each one exists within the same limits. And because of that, everything remains balanced. If we allow ourselves to stay within that balance, even briefly, something becomes quieter. There is no sense of competition, no sense of urgency. Everything that exists here fits within the conditions that allow it to remain. If we follow that idea, the vent begins to feel less like a place and more like a world, not large, not expansive, but complete, a self-contained system that continues without needing anything beyond what it already has. If we remain here, the movement becomes less important. The stillness becomes more present, and within that stillness, life continues softly, without interruption. If we allow ourselves to rest within that scene, even for a moment, something settles. The idea that life must spread widely begins to fade. The idea that growth must be visible softens, because here, life does not expand beyond its limits. It remains within them, and in that remaining, it becomes stable. If we remain here just a little longer, the details begin to soften again. The individual organisms become less distinct. The structure fades slightly into the background. Only the presence remains, a quiet sense that something exists here, continuing. If we allow that feeling to deepen, even the idea of a world begins to soften. It is no longer something separate, no longer something defined by edges. It becomes part of the same endless ocean, connected unbroken. If we remain here, the final sense of this place becomes clear. The vent has become more than an opening, more than a structure. It has become a center of life, not because it forced anything to happen, but because it allowed it. And in that allowance, everything that could exist here does. If we allow ourselves to stay just a little longer, the system continues, the flow rises, the structure holds, life remains. Nothing needs to change, nothing needs to move forward. Everything already continues, softly, steadily, within the limits that allow it to remain. And in that quiet balance, a small world exists, far below, unseen but complete. A world that will not last forever. If we remain here just a little longer, allowing the small world around the vent to continue without interruption, something begins to feel different again. Not in what we see. The structure remains. The flow continues. Life stays gathered where it has found balance. Nothing appears to change, and yet something beneath that stillness is not fixed. If we look carefully, not at the movement, not at the surface, but at the idea of this place, something begins to shift. Until now, everything has felt stable, formed, settled into a quiet rhythm that does not need to be disturbed. Vent continues, life remains, the system holds, but that stability is not permanent. It never has been. If we allow ourselves to rest with that thought, even briefly, the sense of this place begins to soften, not because something is ending now, but because nothing here was ever meant to last forever. The earth beneath the ocean floor continues to move slowly, quietly, just as it did before the vent formed. The same forces that created this opening continue to act upon it. Pressure shifts, heat redistributes, pathways change. If we remain here, those changes are not visible, not in a way we can follow, but they are present always. And over time, they begin to alter the system. If we follow the flow from the vent, it remains steady for now, warm, consistent, supporting everything that has gathered around it. But that flow depends on something deeper, something that is always changing. And as those deeper conditions shift, the flow will shift with them. If we remain here just a little longer, the idea begins to settle. This world exists because the conditions allow it, not because it is fixed, not because it is protected, but because, for now, everything is aligned. If that alignment changes, the system will change with it. If we look again at the organisms around the vent, they remain still, anchored, positioned within the narrow range that allows them to exist. They do not move far. They do not search beyond this place, because everything they need is here. And yet, this place will not always be the same. If we allow ourselves to follow that idea further, something deeper begins to emerge. The life that has gathered here does not control the vent. It does not sustain the flow. It does not hold the structure in place. It exists within the system, but it does not define it. And because of that, it remains connected to something larger, something that continues beyond this small world. If we remain here, the sense of permanence begins to fade, not suddenly, not in a way that creates urgency, but gently, as though the ocean itself is reminding us that everything here is part of a longer process, a process that began before this vent existed and will continue after it is gone. If we drift slightly outward, The surrounding ocean remains unchanged, dark, still, endless. It does not depend on this vent. It does not change because of it. And when the vent fades, the ocean will remain exactly as it is. If we return our attention to the vent, its presence becomes more delicate, not weaker, not diminishing, but more temporary, more connected to time than we first understood. If we remain here just a little longer, something settles. The strength of this place is not in its permanence. It is in its ability to exist while it can, to form, to support life, to continue within the conditions that allow it. And when those conditions change, to end quietly, without disruption, without resistance. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, the idea becomes softer, less about loss, less about ending, and more about continuation. Because when one vent fades, another may begin somewhere else. The earth continues to shift, openings form, flows rise, and new systems take shape. If we remain here, the cycle becomes clearer, not as something dramatic, but as something constant. Creation, continuation, and quiet disappearance, all part of the same slow rhythm. If we look again at the small world around this vent, nothing has changed. The structure remains. Life continues. The flow rises as it always has. But now, there is a different understanding. This is not a fixed place. It is a moment, a long moment, but still a moment within something much larger. If we allow ourselves to rest with that idea, something begins to ease. There is no need for this place to last, no need for it to remain unchanged, because its purpose is not permanence. Its purpose is presence, to exist fully while it can, and to become part of the ocean again when it cannot. If we remain here just a little longer, the edges of the scene begin to soften. The details fade slightly. The structure blends more gently into the surrounding darkness. Life becomes less distinct. Only the sense of something continuing remains. If we allow that feeling to deepen, the transition becomes natural. There is no clear moment when this world will end. No sudden disappearance, only a gradual shift, a slow return to the stillness that was always here. If we remain here for one final moment, the understanding becomes complete. The vent is not separate from the ocean. It is part of its quiet, continuous change, a temporary opening, a brief gathering of life, a small world that exists within a much larger one. And as we begin to drift away, very slowly, the vent remains behind, still active, still present, but now understood differently, not as something permanent, but as something passing. If we rise just a little, the darkness opens again, wide, still, endless, and the small world below becomes part of that stillness once more. If we remain here, the ocean feels the same as it did before, calm, a thing, unchanging, even though we now know that far below, things are always forming, always changing, always beginning again. And in the next part of our journey, we will follow that change more closely, not where it begins, but where it shifts, where the balance becomes unstable and the system we have seen begins to transform slowly, quietly, just as it began. When the balance begins to shift, if we return once more to the vent, allowing ourselves to drift slowly back down through the quiet layers of the ocean. Something feels almost the same. The structure remains. The chimney still rises from the seafloor. The flow continues, carrying warmth and minerals upward into the dark water. Life is still present, still gathered, where the conditions allow it to remain. At first, nothing appears to have changed, and yet, if we remain here just a little longer, something begins to feel different, not in what we see directly, but in the balance that holds everything together. Until now, the system has felt stable, not permanent, but steady, a quiet alignment between the forces below and the conditions above. But that alignment is not fixed. It never has been. If we remain here, allowing time to pass in the slow way it does at this depth, the first changes are almost impossible to notice. The flow from the vent shifts slightly, not stronger, not weaker, just different. The temperature varies by a small degree. The composition of the rising minerals changes, not dramatically, but enough to alter the surrounding water. If we look closely, the movement of the plume becomes less uniform, a slight irregularity, a subtle variation that does not follow the same steady pattern as before. If we remain here, the change continues, slow, gradual, unforced. The earth beneath the seafloor continues to move, and as it does, the pathway that feeds the vent begins to adjust. If we follow that idea, something becomes clear. The vent is not an isolated system. It depends entirely on what happens below, and what happens below is always changing. If we remain here just a little longer, the organisms around the vent begin to respond, not all at once, not in visible ways, but gradually. Some remain exactly where they are, unchanged. Others shift slightly, repositioning within the narrow range that still supports them. If we observe carefully, the density of life changes. In some areas, it becomes thinner. In others, slightly more concentrated. Not because anything is forcing movement, but because the balance that once held everything steady is beginning to shift. If we remain here, the idea of stability begins to soften. The system is still present, still functioning, but no longer perfectly aligned. If we follow a single organism, its movement is minimal, a slight adjustment, then stillness, as though it is responding to something subtle, something we cannot see directly. If we allow ourselves to stay within that observation, even briefly, the pattern becomes clearer. Life here does not react suddenly. It does not rush. It adjusts slowly in response to changes that unfold just as slowly. If we remain here, the flow from the vent continues to shift, not enough to disrupt everything, but enough to change the conditions. And because everything here depends on those conditions, everything begins to respond. If we step back slightly, allowing the scene to widen, the system no longer feels as complete as it once did. Still present, still active, but less settled, less certain. If we remain here just a little longer, the idea begins to settle. The vent is entering a different phase, not ending, not disappearing, but changing. If we allow that to continue, something deeper becomes clear. Balance is not something that remains. It is something that must be maintained. And when the conditions that support it begin to shift, the system must adjust with them. If we look again at the structure of the vent, it remains intact. The chimney still stands. The flow still rises, but the consistency is no longer the same. There are moments when the flow weakens slightly, moments when it strengthens again, not in sharp changes, but in subtle variations. If we remain here, those variations become part of the new rhythm, less predictable, less even. If we follow that rhythm, something begins to feel different. The sense of quiet certainty begins to fade, not replaced by urgency, not replaced by movement, but replaced by something softer, something less defined. If we allow ourselves to stay within that feeling, even briefly, the system begins to feel more delicate, more dependent on the exact conditions that allow it to remain. If those conditions continue to shift, the system will continue to change. If we remain here just a little longer, the organisms around the vent continue their quiet adjustments. Some move slightly closer to the source, others drift outward, not far, not dramatically, but enough to reflect the changing environment. If we observe carefully, the balance is no longer uniform. It varies from one point to another. If we allow that to settle, the understanding becomes clearer. This is how change begins in the deep ocean, not with sudden disruption, not with visible transformation, but with subtle shifts, small variations that continue over time until the system is no longer what it once was. If we remain here, the vent continues, the structure holds, life remains, but everything is slightly different now, slightly less stable, slightly more open to change. If we allow ourselves to rest within that idea, even briefly, something softens. There is no need to follow what comes next, no need to anticipate the outcome, because the process continues on its own, slowly, quietly, without interruption. If we remain here for one final moment, the beginning of change becomes complete. The system has not ended, but it has shifted, and from that shift, everything that follows will emerge. When the flow begins to weaken, if we remain here just a little longer, allowing the subtle shifts within the vent system to continue without interruption, something else begins to change, not in a way that draws attention, not in a way that interrupts the stillness, but gently, almost quietly enough to be missed. The flow that rises from the vent is still present, still warm, still carrying the same elements from deep within the earth, and yet it no longer feels the same. If we look carefully, the movement of the rising plume begins to soften, not disappearing, not stopping, but becoming less consistent. There are moments where it feels slightly weaker, moments where the flow is not as steady as before. If we remain here, those moments do not stand out at first. They blend into the overall rhythm, a slight variation, a small pause within the continuity. But as time passes, those variations begin to repeat more often, more noticeably. If we allow ourselves to stay with that pattern, something becomes clearer. The vent is still active, but the strength of its flow is beginning to change. If we follow the source of that change, it leads downward, back beneath the seafloor, where the pathways that carry heat and minerals are no longer as stable as they once were. If we remain here just a little longer, the idea begins to settle. The flow does not weaken because something above has changed. It weakens because something below is shifting. The earth continues to move, And as it does, the channels that once carried energy freely begin to adjust. Some narrow, some redirect, some slowly close. If we return our attention to the vent, the effects of those deeper changes become more noticeable. The plume rises unevenly now, at times steady, at times softer. If we observe carefully, even the temperature of the surrounding water begins to vary, not dramatically, but enough to affect the balance that once held everything in place. If we remain here, the organisms closest to the vent begin to respond, not quickly, not in visible urgency, but gradually. Some remain in place, unchanged. Others shift slightly, moving closer when the flow strengthens, drifting outward when it weakens. If we allow ourselves to follow one of them, its movement is minimal, a small adjustment, then stillness, as though it is waiting, not for something to happen, but for the conditions to settle. If we remain here just a little longer, the pattern continues. The flow rises, then softens, then rises again, never fully stopping, but no longer consistent. If we allow that rhythm to settle in, something begins to feel different. The sense of certainty that once defined this place becomes less clear. The system is still functioning, still present, but no longer steady in the same way. If we step back slightly, allowing the scene to widen, the vent still stands. The structure remains intact. Life is still gathered around it, but the center of the system, the flow itself, is changing. If we remain here, the idea of decline begins to take shape, not as an ending, not as a loss, but as a gradual reduction, a soft easing of the forces that once defined this place. If we allow ourselves to stay within that idea, even briefly, something becomes clearer. Nothing here disappears suddenly, nothing collapses all at once. Everything changes slowly, in the same quiet way that it formed. If we look again at the surface of the vent, the layers remain, the structure holds, but the buildup of new material begins to slow. The growth that once continued steadily is now less active, less present. If we remain here just a little longer, the change becomes more noticeable. The plume is thinner, the movement softer, the surrounding water less altered than before. If we follow that change, even briefly, the system begins to feel lighter, less defined, less concentrated. If we allow ourselves to rest within that feeling, something begins to ease. There is no urgency, no sudden shift, only a gradual return toward the stillness that surrounds everything here. If we remain here, the organisms continue their quiet adjustments. Some remain close, others move slightly farther away, not in search of something new, but in response to what is slowly changing. If we observe carefully, the density of life begins to thin, not disappearing, but spreading out, less concentrated around the center. If we allow that to settle, the understanding becomes clearer. The vent is still present, but its influence is beginning to fade. If we remain here just a little longer, the flow continues, still rising, still carrying warmth, but no longer with the same strength, no longer with the same consistency. If we allow ourselves to follow that pattern, even briefly, something becomes softer. The system is not ending, it is transitioning from one state into another. If we remain here, the final sense of this stage begins to settle. The vent is no longer growing, no longer fully stable, but not yet gone. It exists in between strength and stillness, between presence and absence. If we allow ourselves to rest within that space, even for a moment, everything becomes quieter, less defined, less certain, but still continuing. If we remain here for one final moment, the shift becomes complete. The flow has not stopped, but it has changed, and from that change, everything that follows will emerge. When life begins to leave, if we remain here just a little longer, allowing the weakening flow of the vent to continue in its quieter rhythm, something else begins to change, not in the structure, not in the shape of the vent itself, but in the presence that once gathered around it. Life is still here, still close to the surface of the vent, still positioned where the conditions have supported it for so long. And yet, if we look carefully, the sense of fullness that once defined this place begins to soften, not disappearing, not fading all at once, but becoming less complete. If we remain here, the first changes are subtle. A small space appears where there was once a continuous layer of organisms, a slight gap, barely noticeable. If we look again, another appears nearby, not connected, not forming a pattern, just small areas where the presence of life is no longer as dense as it once was. If we allow ourselves to stay with that observation, even briefly, the pattern becomes clearer. The system is not losing everything, but it is no longer holding everything in place. If we follow a single organism, it remains still for a moment. Then, slowly, it shifts, not far, not quickly, but enough to change its position relative to the vent, as though responding to something subtle, something that no longer feels exactly the same. If we remain here just a little longer, others begin to do the same. A quiet repositioning, a gradual movement outward, not as a group, not as a sudden migration, but as individual responses to changing conditions. If we allow ourselves to observe without expectation, something begins to settle. Life here does not leave all at once. It does not rush. It does not react suddenly. It adjusts slowly, in the same way that everything here has always changed. If we look again at the flow from the vent, it is still present, still rising, but weaker, less consistent. And because of that, the narrow balance that once supported so much life begins to shift. If we remain here, the organisms closest to the source still hold their positions for now, but even there, the density begins to thin, not dramatically, but enough to notice over time. If we step back slightly, allowing the scene to widen, the vent still appears active, still surrounded by life, but the sense of concentration has changed. The edges of this small world are no longer clearly defined. They soften, they spread. If we allow ourselves to follow that softening, even briefly, something deeper becomes clear. This place is no longer a center, not in the way it once was. The energy that once gathered everything here is beginning to fade, and as it fades, the system begins to open. If we remain here just a little longer, the movement becomes easier to notice. Some organisms drift farther from the vent, not carried by strong currents, but by the absence of what once held them in place. Others remain, but their presence becomes more isolated, more spaced. If we follow one of them, it settles again, still unmoving, as though waiting not for something to return, but for the environment to define what is possible. If we remain here, the pattern continues. Less gathering, more space, less density, more quiet separation. If we allow that pattern to settle, even briefly, something begins to feel different. The sense of a world begins to fade, not because it has ended, but because it is no longer complete. If we look again at the structure of the vent, it remains unchanged. The chimney still stands. The shape is still present, but what once defined it, the life that gathered around it, is slowly shifting away. If we remain here just a little longer, the change becomes more noticeable. The surface of the vent is less covered, more exposed. The layers of life that once formed a continuous presence are now interrupted, separated. If we allow ourselves to stay with that image, even briefly, something becomes clearer. This is not disappearance. This is redistribution. Life is not ending. It is moving, adjusting to new conditions, finding places where the balance still holds. If we drift slightly outward, the surrounding ocean begins to feel more connected to the vent than before. The boundary between here and there softens because what once concentrated life here is no longer as strong. If we remain here, the system continues to loosen, not collapsing, not breaking apart, but opening. If we follow that idea, something deeper begins to settle. The vent is no longer holding life in place, and without that hole, life begins to spread. If we allow ourselves to rest within that understanding, even briefly, the scene becomes quieter, less defined, less centered. If we look again, there are still organisms near the vent, still present, still continuing, but fewer, more spaced. If we remain here just a little longer, the final sense of this stage begins to form. The system is not gone, but it is no longer what it was. It is shifted from a place of gathering to a place of quiet dispersal. If we allow that to settle fully, something becomes softer. There is no sense of loss, no sense of urgency, only change. Slow, natural, uninterrupted. If we remain here for one final moment, the movement becomes almost still again. The vent remains, life remains, but everything is lighter, less concentrated, more open. And from that openness, the next stage will continue. The return to stillness. If we remain here just a little longer, allowing the quiet dispersal of life around the vent to continue, something begins to soften even further, not in a way that can be clearly seen, not in a way that marks a moment, but in the overall feeling of this place. Until now, the vent has been a center, a place where energy gathered, where structure formed, where life remained. But now, that sense of center begins to fade. If we look again, the structure is still there. The chimney still rises from the seafloor. The flow, though weaker, still moves upward, and life, though less dense, still exists around it. Nothing has disappeared, and yet everything feels quieter, more open, less defined. If we remain here, allowing this quieter state to settle, the system begins to feel lighter, not reduced, not diminished, but less concentrated, less held together by a single source. If we drift slightly outward, the surrounding ocean no longer feels separate. The boundary that once defined this place begins to dissolve. The vent is no longer a distinct world. It is becoming part of the wider stillness once again. If we allow ourselves to stay within that transition, even briefly, something becomes clear. This is not an ending. It is a return, a slow movement back toward the state that existed before the vent formed. If we look again at the organisms that remain, they are still positioned, continuing, but more spaced now, more independent, no longer gathered tightly around a single point. If we follow one of them, it does not move far, it does not search, it simply remains, as though the need to stay close to the vent has softened. If we remain here just a little longer, the pattern continues. Less concentration, more space. Less activity, more stillness. If we allow that pattern to settle, something begins to feel familiar. The deep ocean, in its natural state, is quiet, wide, unchanging. And as the influence of the vent fades, that quiet begins to return. If we remain here, the flow from the vent becomes less noticeable, still present, but no longer the defining feature of this place. If we follow it, even briefly, it rises gently, then blends into the surrounding water, no longer forming a strong contrast, no longer shaping everything around it. If we allow ourselves to rest within that change, even for a moment, something begins to ease. The sense of structure softens. The sense of activity fades. Only the presence remains. If we look again at the vent, it is still there, but it no longer feels like a center. It feels like part of the background, a quiet feature within a much larger space. If we remain here just a little longer, even the idea of a system begins to dissolve. There is no longer a clear boundary, no clear beginning or end, only a gradual blending. If we allow that blending to continue, something deeper begins to settle. The ocean does not hold on to what forms within it. It allows, it supports, and when conditions change, it returns everything gently back into itself. If we remain here, the final traces of concentration begin to fade. Life is still present, but no longer gathered, no longer defined by a single source. If we follow that change, even briefly, the scene becomes simpler, less detail, less distinction, more stillness. If we allow ourselves to stay within that simplicity, something becomes quieter. The need to observe fades. The need to follow fades. Everything continues without requiring attention. If we remain here just a little longer, the vent becomes less visible, not because it has disappeared, but because it no longer stands apart. It blends into the surrounding seafloor, part of the same quiet landscape. If we allow that to settle fully, the return becomes complete. The ocean is as it was, still, dark, endless, and the small world that once existed here is now part of that stillness. If we remain here, even the idea of change begins to fade. There is no sense of before, no sense of after, only what is present now, a quiet continuation. If we allow ourselves to rest within that presence, even briefly, everything softens. Thoughts become lighter, less defined. The need to follow anything disappears. If we remain here, the final sense of this part becomes clear. Nothing has been lost. Nothing has ended. Everything has simply returned to the same quiet state from which it began. If we allow that idea to settle, Even for a moment, it becomes calm, natural, unforced. If we remain here for one final moment, the ocean continues, unchanged, unbroken, and within that stillness, everything that once formed has become part of it again. When a vent falls silent, if we return once more to the ocean floor, allowing ourselves to descend slowly through the quiet layers of water, something feels different, not in a way that can be seen immediately, not in the shape of the seafloor, but in what is no longer present. The vent still exists. The structure remains where it formed. The chimney still rises, though more faintly now, from the surrounding sediment. And yet, if we remain here just a little longer, something becomes clear. The movement that once defined this place has nearly disappeared. If we look closely, the flow from the vent is still there, but it is no longer steady, no longer strong enough to shape the water around it. It rises slowly, faintly, then blends into the surrounding darkness. Almost immediately, if we remain here, the warmth that once marked this place begins to soften, not gone, but reduced, less distinct, less capable of sustaining what once gathered here. If we allow ourselves to stay within this quiet change, even briefly, the difference becomes easier to feel. This place is no longer active in the way it once was. It is no longer forming, no longer growing. It is becoming still. If we look again at the structure of the vent, its surface is more exposed now, less covered by the layers of life that once gathered around it. The forms that once filled every space have thinned, and in many places, they are no longer present at all. If we remain here just a little longer, the absence becomes more noticeable, not as something missing, but as something that has already passed. If we follow a small section of the structure, it remains unchanged, solid, still, but quiet, without movement, without the subtle interactions that once defined its surface. If we allow ourselves to rest within that stillness, something begins to settle. The vent is no longer a system. It is no longer a center of energy. It is becoming part of the seafloor once again. If we drift slightly outward, the surrounding ocean feels unchanged, dark, calm, endless. And now, this place feels the same, no longer distinct, no longer separate. If we remain here, the final traces of flow continue, faint, intermittent, then softer still. If we follow that fading, even briefly, something becomes clear. There is no sudden moment when the vent stops, no clear ending, only a gradual quieting, a slow reduction, until what once defined this place is no longer present. If we allow that idea to settle, even for a moment, the change becomes easier to accept. Nothing here ends abruptly. Everything returns gently. If we remain here just a little longer, the structure itself begins to feel different, not changing in shape, but changing in meaning. It is no longer an active source, no longer a place where energy rises. It is a remnant, a trace of what once existed. If we look again, the chimney stands, but it does not release anything that shapes the surrounding water. It simply remains. If we allow ourselves to stay within that presence, even briefly, something becomes quieter. There is no need to follow anything, no need to observe any movement, because there is none that defines this place anymore. If we remain here the ocean reclaims the space, not by force, not by change, but by stillness. The same stillness that exists everywhere else at this depth. If we allow that stillness to settle fully, something deeper begins to form. The vent has not disappeared. It has become part of the larger whole, no longer separate, no longer active, just present. If we remain here just a little longer, the final sense of this stage becomes clear. The life that once gathered here has moved. The flow that once sustained it has faded, and what remains is quiet, complete. If we allow ourselves to rest within that quiet, even briefly, everything softens. There is nothing to follow, nothing to anticipate, only presence. If we remain here for one final moment, the understanding becomes complete. The vent has not ended. It has simply become still. And within that stillness, it remains. What remains after life moves on? If we remain here just a little longer, allowing the silence around the vent to settle fully, something begins to feel different again. Not because something new has appeared, but because what once defined this place is no longer present. The movement has faded. The flow has softened into something barely noticeable, and the life that once gathered here has moved on. If we look now, the structure remains. The chimney still rises from the seafloor, its shape unchanged, its presence steady, but it no longer feels like a center. It no longer draws anything toward it. If we remain here, the absence becomes clearer, not empty, not hollow, but quiet in a different way. A quiet that does not expect anything to happen. If we allow ourselves to stay within that quiet, even briefly, something begins to settle. There is no activity to follow, no subtle movement to observe, only stillness. If we look closely at the surface of the structure, it is no longer layered with life, no longer covered by the presence that once formed a living surface. Instead, it is bare, exposed, a simple form, shaped by what once flowed through it. If we remain here just a little longer, even that form begins to feel less defined, not changing, not disappearing, but blending softly into the surrounding seafloor. If we allow ourselves to follow that blending, even briefly, something becomes clear. This place is no longer separate. It is part of the same wide, quiet landscape that surrounds it. If we drift slightly outward, there is no boundary that marks where the vent ends and the ocean begins, only a gradual transition, a soft merging. If we remain here, the idea of a place begins to fade. There is no longer a center, no longer a defined system, only a quiet area within the larger ocean. If we allow that idea to settle, even for a moment, something becomes easier. There is nothing to follow, nothing to understand, nothing to hold. If a thought appears, it is faint, soft. It does not continue. It fades quickly, leaving space behind. If we remain here, that space becomes more present than anything else. Not empty, but open. If we allow ourselves to rest within that openness, even briefly, the need to observe begins to fade. There is nothing left that requires attention, nothing that changes in a way that needs to be followed. If we look again at the structure, it remains, but it no longer holds meaning in the same way. It is not a source, not a system, just a form, quiet, unchanging, If we remain here just a little longer, even the idea of what remains begins to soften, because nothing here is separate enough to be defined that way. Everything is part of the same stillness. If we allow ourselves to stay within that stillness, even briefly, something deeper begins to settle. The ocean does not hold on to what has passed. It does not preserve what once existed. It allows everything to return gently, naturally, without resistance. If we remain here, the last traces of distinction begin to fade. The structure blends, the seafloor continues, the darkness remains unchanged. If we allow that to settle fully, the scene becomes simple. Nothing stands out, nothing draws attention, only presence. If we follow that presence, even briefly, it does not lead anywhere, it does not guide, it simply exists. If we remain here just a little longer, the sense of time begins to soften. There is no before, no memory of what this place once was, no anticipation of what it might become, only now. And even that becomes lighter, less defined. If we allow ourselves to rest within that feeling, even briefly, something begins to ease. There is no need to continue, no need to observe. Everything already continues on its own. If we remain here, even the idea of remaining becomes unnecessary. There is no effort to stay, no effort to follow, only quiet, endless. If we allow that quiet to deepen, the distinction between the structure and the ocean disappears completely. Everything becomes the same, still, soft, unbroken. If we remain here for a final moment, the understanding becomes complete. Nothing has been left behind. Nothing has been lost. Everything has simply returned to the same quiet state from which it began. If we allow ourselves to rest within that return, even briefly, everything softens. Thoughts fade. Awareness lightens. The need to follow anything disappears. And what remains is only the quiet. The ocean that continues. If we remain here just a little longer, allowing the quiet around us to settle completely, something begins to feel even softer, not because anything has changed, but because nothing needs to. The ocean continues, not in a way that asks to be followed, not in a way that creates movement we need to notice, but in a quiet, steady presence that has always been here. If we look around now, there is no center, no structure that draws attention, no place that stands apart from the rest, only darkness, wide, still, endless. If we remain here, even the memory of what once existed begins to fade. The vent, the flow, the life that gathered, all of it becomes softer, less defined, not gone, but no longer something we need to hold. If we allow ourselves to stay within this space, even briefly, something becomes easier. There is nothing to follow, nothing to understand, nothing to continue, because everything already continues. If a faint movement appears somewhere in the distance, it does not matter. It does not change the stillness. It does not interrupt the quiet. It simply happens and then fades. If we remain here, that pattern repeats. A small shift, then stillness, then another, then nothing. And within that rhythm, there is no expectation, no need for something to happen next. If we allow ourselves to follow that rhythm, even for a moment, something begins to settle. The mind no longer reaches forward. It no longer looks for what comes next. It begins to rest where it is. If a thought appears, it is soft. It does not stay. It fades quickly, leaving space behind. And that space feels calm. If we remain here just a little longer, even the idea of observing begins to dissolve. There is no longer anything to observe, only something to be within, a quiet presence that does not need attention. If we allow ourselves to rest within that presence, even briefly, everything becomes lighter, less defined, less separate. If we follow a single breath, it rises slowly, then falls. No need to change it, no need to guide it. It continues on its own. If we remain here, the breath becomes part of the same quiet rhythm, not separate, not distinct, just another gentle movement within stillness. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, something deeper begins to form. The ocean does not move toward an ending. It does not reach a conclusion. It continues, always, in the same quiet way. If we remain here, the idea of time begins to soften. There is no sense of how long we have been here, no sense of what comes next, only now. And even that becomes lighter, more open, if we allow ourselves to stay within that openness. Even briefly, the need to hold on to anything begins to fade. There is nothing to hold, nothing to keep. Everything passes gently. If we remain here just a little longer, even the sense of being here begins to soften. There is no boundary, no clear edge between where we are and the ocean itself, only a shared stillness. If we allow that stillness to deepen, everything becomes simple. No movement that needs attention, no thought that needs to continue, no direction, no distance, only presence. If we remain here, the final sense of this space becomes clear. The ocean continues, unchanged, unbroken. Everything that forms within it returns to it. If we allow ourselves to rest within that understanding, even briefly, something settles completely. There is no need to follow the story further, no need to reach an ending, because there is no ending here, only continuation. If we remain here for one final moment, even that moment becomes soft, unmarked, unnoticed, and within that softness, everything rests. The quiet that remains. If we remain here just a little longer, there is almost nothing left to follow. The ocean continues, but it no longer asks to be seen. It no longer asks to be understood. Everything that needed to happen has already passed. What remains now is something softer, quieter, more complete. If we look around, there is no structure that stands apart, no movement that draws attention, no change that needs to be followed, only stillness, wide, endless. If a faint shift happens somewhere, it fades before it becomes anything we need to notice. If a thought begins, it softens before it forms. Everything becomes lighter, more distant, more gentle. If we remain here, even the idea of observing begins to dissolve. There is no longer anything to observe, only something to be within, a quiet space that does not require attention, does not require awareness, only allows. If we allow ourselves to rest here, even briefly, something settles completely, not in the ocean, but in the way we experience it. There is no need to follow anything, no need to continue anything. Everything already continues on its own, softly. If a breath rises, it is slow, If it falls, it is just as gentle. It does not mark time. It does not measure anything. It simply continues, part of the same quiet flow. If we remain here, the boundary between inside and outside fades. There is no separation, no edge, only a shared stillness. If we allow that stillness to deepen, even briefly, something begins to ease. There is no need to stay aware, no need to remain present. Presence is already here. If a thought appears, it does not stay. It fades gently. Another does not follow immediately. There is space, and within that space, everything rests. If we remain here just a little longer, even the idea of time begins to dissolve. There is no before, no after, no sense of how long we have been here, only this quiet. And even that becomes softer, less defined. If we allow ourselves to stay within that softness, even briefly, everything becomes simple. Nothing to follow, nothing to hold, nothing to continue. Everything already continues. The ocean does not move toward an ending. It does not reach a conclusion. It simply remains. And in that remaining, there is nothing missing. If this quiet has brought you even a small sense of ease, a slower breath, a softer moment, you can always return here. There will always be another quiet place, another slow descent, another space where nothing needs to happen and everything is already enough. If you'd like more journeys like this, you're always welcome to stay. But for now, there is nothing more to follow, nothing more to see, nothing more to understand, only the quiet that remains and the ocean continuing far below, unseen, unbroken, endless. The ocean after the vent. If we return once more to the place where the vent once stood, allowing ourselves to descend slowly through the quiet layers of the ocean, something feels almost unchanged at first. The darkness is still here. The seafloor remains. The same wide, silent landscape stretches in every direction. Nothing moves in a way that asks for attention. Nothing shifts in a way that needs to be followed. And yet, if we remain here just a little longer, something begins to feel different, not in what we see, but in what is no longer present. The vent is no longer active. The flow that once rose steadily from the earth below has softened. The warmth that once marked this place has faded into the surrounding water, and what remains now is something quieter, something more uniform, something that no longer stands apart. If we look carefully, the structure is still there. The chimney still rises gently from the seafloor, its form unchanged, its presence steady. But it no longer defines the space around it. It no longer gathers anything toward it. It no longer creates a center. If we remain here, allowing our attention to settle more slowly, the boundary between the structure and the surrounding ocean begins to soften. There is no clear edge, no line where one ends and the other begins, only a gradual blending. The same darkness covering everything, the same stillness surrounding it. If we allow ourselves to stay within that blending, even briefly, something begins to ease. There is no need to locate where we are, no need to define this place, because this place is no longer separate. It is part of the same continuous ocean. If we look outward, there is no difference. The same quiet extends in every direction. If we look back toward the structure, it no longer draws the eye. It no longer asks to be noticed. It simply remains. If we remain here just a little longer, the idea of a center begins to fade completely. There is no point that gathers attention, no place that holds meaning above the rest. Everything is evenly quiet, evenly still. If we allow that feeling to deepen, even briefly, something becomes lighter. The need to follow anything begins to soften. The need to understand what has happened fades, because nothing here requires understanding. Everything already continues. If we follow a single breath now, it rises slowly, then falls, soft, unforced. If we remain here, that breath becomes part of the same quiet rhythm, not separate, not distinct, just another gentle movement within stillness. If we allow that rhythm to continue, something begins to settle. The ocean does not move toward anything. It does not move away from anything. It simply continues. If we remain here, even the idea of movement becomes less important. There is no need for anything to change, no need for anything to happen, because everything that needed to happen has already passed. If we look again at the seafloor, it is simple, flat, unmarked. The place where the vent once shaped the environment is no longer different from the rest. It has returned, not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually. If we allow ourselves to rest within that return, even briefly, something becomes clear. The ocean does not hold on to what forms within it. It does not preserve what once existed. It allows everything to become part of itself again. If we remain here, the last traces of difference begin to fade. The structure remains, but its meaning softens. It is no longer a source, no longer a system, just a form, quiet, unchanging. If we allow ourselves to stay within that quiet, even briefly, something begins to deepen. The stillness is no longer something we notice. It is something we are within. There is no edge to it, no boundary, no place where it begins or ends. If we remain here just a little longer, even the idea of here begins to dissolve. There is no location that needs to be held, no position that needs to be maintained, only presence. If a thought appears, it is soft, it does not stay. It fades quickly, leaving space behind. If we remain here, that space becomes more present than anything else, not empty, but open. If we allow ourselves to rest within that openness, even briefly, the need to continue thinking fades. There is nothing to complete, nothing to follow. Everything already continues. If we remain here just a little longer, even the sense of time begins to soften. There is no before, no after, no sequence of events, only this quiet. And even that becomes lighter, less defined. If we allow that to settle fully, something deeper begins to form. The ocean is not a place of beginnings or endings. It is a place of continuation. Everything that forms within it returns to it. If we remain here, the stillness becomes complete, not because something has ended, but because nothing needs to continue. If we allow ourselves to stay here for one final moment, even the idea of staying disappears. There is no effort, no direction, no need to remain aware, only quiet, endless. If we remain here, the ocean continues, unchanged, unbroken, and within that continuation, everything rests, drifting through endless stillness. If we remain here, allowing the quiet of the ocean to settle more deeply around us, something begins to feel even more expansive, not because the space has changed, but because there is nothing left that defines it. The place where the vent once stood has already softened into the surrounding seafloor. The structure remains, but it no longer holds attention. The memory of movement has faded, and what remains now is something wider than before, something that does not begin at a point, something that does not end anywhere we can sense. If we allow ourselves to drift slowly through this space, without direction, without intention, the ocean begins to feel less like a place and more like a condition, a quiet state that surrounds everything equally. If we look outward, there is no horizon, no edge, no shift in color or light that marks distance, only darkness that feels continuous, unbroken. If we remain here, even the sense of distance begins to soften. There is no far, no near, only a gradual fading of awareness as things become less distinct. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, something begins to ease. There is no need to measure anything, no need to locate anything, because nothing here depends on position. If we follow a slow drift through the water, it is almost impossible to tell whether we are moving at all. There is no reference point, no current strong enough to guide us, only a gentle suspension. If we remain within that suspension, even for a moment, something begins to quiet further. The body does not need to adjust. The mind does not need to follow. Everything already continues. If we allow ourselves to rest within that continuation, even briefly, the need to define anything begins to fade. There is no need to describe what we are seeing, no need to understand what this place is, because this place is not something separate. It is simply the ocean continuing. If we remain here just a little longer, even the idea of drifting begins to soften. There is no movement that needs to be tracked, no direction that needs to be held, only a slow, almost imperceptible change that does not lead anywhere. If we allow that to continue, even briefly, something becomes lighter. The sense of control fades. The need to stay aware softens. If a thought appears, it does not fully form. It dissolves before it can continue, leaving behind a small, quiet space. If we remain here, that space begins to expand, not as something that grows, but as something that was always present. If we allow ourselves to rest within that space, even briefly, the mind begins to slow, not forced, not guided, but naturally. If we follow a single breath, it rises slowly, then falls. The movement is soft, unmarked. If we remain here, that breath becomes part of the same endless stillness. It does not stand apart. It does not define anything. It simply continues. If we allow that rhythm to settle, something deeper begins to form. The ocean is not moving toward anything. It is not building toward a moment. It is not waiting. It is simply here. If we remain here just a little longer, even the sense of being within the ocean begins to soften. There is no boundary between us and the space around us, no edge where one ends and the other begins, only a shared stillness. If we allow that stillness to deepen, even briefly, everything becomes simpler. There is no need to observe, no need to follow, no need to remain focused. Everything continues without needing attention. If we remain here, the darkness becomes softer, not lighter, but less defined, less something we look at and more something we are within. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, something begins to ease further. The idea of form fades. The idea of structure fades. Everything becomes less distinct if we remain here just a little longer. Even the idea of time begins to dissolve. There is no sense of how long we have been here, no sense of when this began, no sense of what comes next. Only this quiet, and even that becomes softer if we allow ourselves to stay within that softness, even briefly. Everything becomes lighter, less separate, less held together. If a thought begins, it fades. If another tries to follow, it does not fully form. There is space between them, and that space feels calm. If we remain here, that calm becomes more present than anything else. Not something we create, not something we maintain, but something that exists naturally. If we allow ourselves to rest within that calm, even briefly, something settles completely. There is no need to continue, no need to stay aware, no need to follow anything. Everything already continues. If we remain here just a little longer, even the sense of self begins to soften. There is no clear boundary, no defined position, only presence. If we allow that presence to deepen, even briefly, everything becomes quiet, not empty, but complete. If we remain here, the ocean continues, unchanged, unbroken, and within that continuation, nothing needs to be held, nothing needs to be remembered, nothing needs to be followed. If we allow ourselves to stay within that understanding, even briefly, everything softens further. The need to think fades. The need to observe fades. Only the quiet remains. If we remain here for a final moment, even that moment becomes soft, unmarked, unnoticed, and within that softness, everything rests. The cycle that never stops. If we remain here, allowing the stillness to continue without interruption, something begins to feel slightly different again. Not in the ocean itself, not in the quiet that surrounds everything, but in a very subtle sense that something, somewhere, is always beginning again. Not here, not in this exact place, but somewhere within the vastness that stretches far beyond what we can see. If we allow ourselves to stay within this quiet, even briefly, the ocean does not change. The darkness remains. The stillness continues. And yet, beneath that stillness, something deeper is always in motion, far below the seafloor, where no light has ever reached. The earth itself continues. Heat moves slowly through layers of rock. Pressure builds and shifts in ways that are too gradual to notice. Nothing sudden, nothing urgent, only a slow, continuous process that never truly stops. If we remain here just a little longer, allowing that idea to settle, something becomes clear. The vent that once existed here did not begin suddenly. It did not appear without cause. It formed because of processes that had already been moving long before it appeared. If we allow ourselves to follow that idea, even briefly, the stillness we feel now becomes part of something larger, something that does not end, something that does not pause. If we remain here, even though this place has returned to quiet, somewhere else the conditions are slowly forming again. Not quickly, not in a way that can be seen, but gradually, deep beneath the ocean floor. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, something begins to feel different. The stillness is no longer empty. It is full, of quiet potential, not as something that needs to happen, but as something that always exists. If we remain here just a little longer, even the idea of ending begins to soften. Nothing here truly ends. It only changes form. If we follow that thought gently, without holding on to it, something becomes easier. The vent that once lived here has become still, but the conditions that created it have not disappeared. They continue slowly, quietly, without interruption. If we remain here, the ocean above remains unchanged, still, dark, endless, but far below, something is always moving. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, the idea of a cycle begins to form, not as a pattern we need to track, not as something that repeats in a way we can observe, but as a quiet continuation that never stops. If we remain here just a little longer, that idea becomes softer, less something we think about and more something we feel. The ocean does not begin, it does not end, it continues. And within that continuation, things form, things fade, things return. If we allow ourselves to stay within that understanding, even briefly, something begins to ease. There is no need to hold on to what has passed, no need to anticipate what will come. Everything already exists within the same quiet flow. If we remain here, even the idea of before and after begins to dissolve. There is no clear sequence, only a continuous unfolding. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, something becomes lighter. The need to follow a story fades. The need to understand fades. Only presence remains. If we remain here just a little longer, the cycle continues quietly. Somewhere far away, heat gathers, pressure builds, small changes begin beneath the ocean floor, unseen, unnoticed. If we allow that to exist without following it, even briefly, something becomes calm. There is no need to know where, no need to imagine how, only the understanding that it happens always. If we remain here, the ocean does not rush toward that moment. It does not prepare. It does not wait. It simply continues. If we allow ourselves to rest within that continuation, even briefly, something settles deeply. The idea of time fades. The idea of sequence fades. Everything becomes part of the same quiet process. If we remain here just a little longer, even the idea of a cycle begins to soften. There is no clear beginning, no clear end, only a quiet movement that never stops. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, everything becomes simple. Nothing to follow, nothing to hold, nothing to complete. Everything already continues. If we remain here, the stillness remains unchanged, unbroken, and within that stillness, something always begins again. Somewhere, a new vent is forming. If we remain here, allowing the quiet of the ocean to continue without interruption, something begins to take shape again, very gently, far beyond where we are. Not here, not in this still place where everything has already softened and returned, but somewhere else, somewhere deeper, somewhere unseen. If we allow that idea to settle slowly, without trying to follow it too closely, something begins to form, not as an image, but as a quiet understanding. The ocean does not remain in one state forever. Even when everything feels still, something is always beginning. If we remain here just a little longer, letting that thought drift softly, we begin to sense what cannot be seen far beneath the seafloor, beyond layers of sediment and stone. The earth continues its slow, steady movement. Heat moves through rock. Pressure builds in silence. Nothing sudden, nothing urgent, only a gradual change that takes place over time too long to measure. If we allow ourselves to stay within that idea, even briefly, it does not feel active. It does not feel like something is happening. It feels like something is always happening, quietly, continuously. If we remain here, that sense becomes softer. We do not need to imagine the exact place. We do not need to see where it is, only to understand that somewhere the conditions are slowly forming again. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, something begins to feel familiar. The same quiet processes that once created the vent we have just left behind are still moving. They did not stop. They did not end. They simply continue. If we remain here just a little longer, the idea becomes easier to rest with. There is no need to follow where this new beginning is. No need to imagine its shape. No need to understand how it will form, because it is not forming for us to see. It is forming because the earth continues. If we allow ourselves to rest within that continuation, even briefly, something becomes calm. The need to know fades. The need to observe fades. Only the quiet certainty remains. If we remain here, somewhere far below, a small shift occurs, not as a movement we would notice, not as an event that marks a moment, but as a gradual change in pressure, a subtle adjustment in heat. If we allow that to exist without following it, even briefly, something becomes lighter. We do not need to track it. We do not need to hold on to it. It continues on its own. If we remain here just a little longer, that small change continues. Rock softens in ways too slow to feel. Heat finds paths through narrow spaces. Tiny openings begin to form, not visible, not defined, only present. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, something begins to form within the quiet. Not a structure, not yet, but the beginning of possibility. If we remain here, that possibility does not rush. It does not grow quickly. It remains subtle, barely noticeable. If we allow ourselves to stay within that subtlety, even briefly, something becomes easier. There is no need to anticipate what will happen next. No need to imagine a result. Everything is already unfolding. If we remain here just a little longer, the pressure deep below continues to shift, slowly, steadily, without pause. And within that shift, something begins to open. A path, narrow, unseen, but real. If we allow that idea to rest quietly, even briefly, something becomes clear. The beginning of an event is not an event. It is a process, one that happens over time so long that it cannot be measured in moments. If we remain here, the ocean above remains unchanged, still, dark, endless, and far below, something continues to form. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, the contrast becomes gentle. Above, stillness. Below, quiet movement, but neither interrupts the other. They exist together. If we remain here just a little longer, the path beneath the seafloor becomes slightly more defined, not in a way we can see, but in a way that continues. Heat moves upward, pressure adjusts, and slowly, something begins to take shape. If we allow ourselves ourselves to stay within that process, even briefly, something becomes calm. There is no moment where it begins, no moment where it suddenly appears, only a gradual unfolding. If we remain here, the idea of somewhere becomes less important. It is not a place we need to locate. It is simply part of the ocean, part of the earth. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, everything becomes softer. There is no need to imagine distance, no need to think about where it is happening, only that it is happening. If we remain here just a little longer, the process continues, unseen, unheard, unfelt, and yet completely real. If we allow that to exist without following it, even briefly, something becomes still again. The mind does not reach toward it. It does not try to hold it. It allows it to be. If we remain here, the beginning continues quietly. Somewhere far below, something is slowly forming, not yet visible, not yet defined, but already present. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, something becomes clear. The ocean never truly stops. Even in its deepest stillness, something is always beginning again. If we remain here just a little longer, even that idea begins to soften. It is no longer something we think about. It becomes something we rest within. If we allow ourselves to stay within that rest, even briefly, everything becomes quiet again. The stillness returns, the darkness remains, and somewhere, without needing to be seen, a new beginning continues. The beginning that feels like an ending. If we remain here just a little longer, allowing the quiet to continue without interruption, something begins to feel complete, not because something has ended, but because everything has settled into a state where nothing needs to continue. The ocean remains as it is, still, dark, endless, and within that stillness, something subtle begins to take shape, not as a change we can see, but as a quiet understanding that does not need to be followed. If we allow ourselves to stay within this space, even briefly, the sense of a journey begins to soften. There is no clear beginning behind us, no clear ending ahead, only a slow, continuous presence that does not move toward anything. If we remain here, the idea of progression fades. There is no next step, no next moment, only this quiet, and even that becomes lighter. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, something begins to ease. There is no need to follow what has been described, no need to remember what has passed. Everything already exists within the same stillness. If we remain here just a little longer, even the idea of a story begins to dissolve. There is no sequence that needs to be held together, no structure that needs to be maintained, only a gentle unfolding that has already completed itself. If we allow that to rest, even briefly, something becomes very calm. The need to think fades. The need to follow fades. Only presence remains. If we remain here, the ocean does not change. It does not shift. It does not reveal anything new. And because of that, the need to observe disappears. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, something becomes lighter. The effort to remain aware fades. The effort to stay present fades. Presence is already here. If we remain here just a little longer, even the idea of being here becomes unnecessary. There is no location, no position, only quiet, If we allow that quiet to deepen, even briefly, everything softens further. The sense of form fades. The sense of structure fades. Everything becomes less distinct. If we remain here, even the idea of the ocean begins to soften. It is no longer something we imagine, no longer something we visualize, only a quiet presence that does not need to be named. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, something becomes very still. The mind no longer reaches. It no longer moves forward. It rests. If we remain here just a little longer, even the sense of rest becomes lighter, less defined, less something we hold on to. If we allow that to continue, even briefly, everything becomes simple. Nothing to follow, nothing to hold, nothing to keep. Everything already is. If we remain here, the quiet becomes complete, not because something has ended, but because nothing needs to continue. If we allow ourselves to stay within that completeness, even briefly, something settles deeply. The need to think fades. The need to observe fades. Only presence remains. If we remain here just a little longer, even that presence becomes lighter, less something we notice and more something we dissolve into. If we allow that to deepen, even briefly, everything softens completely. There is no separation, no distinction, only stillness. If we remain here, the ocean continues, not moving, not changing, not ending, only continuing. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, something begins to feel familiar. This quiet, this stillness, this sense of endless continuation is the same place where everything begins. If we remain here just a little longer, the connection becomes softer. What feels like an ending is not separate from a beginning. It is the same state, the same quiet. If we allow that to rest gently, even briefly, something becomes clear without needing to be understood. There is no true end. There is no true beginning, only a continuous unfolding that does not pause. If we remain here, the stillness holds everything. What has passed? What is present? What will form again? All of it exists within the same quiet space. If we allow ourselves to stay within that space, even briefly, something settles completely. There is no need to return, no need to begin again, because nothing ever truly stopped. If we remain here just a little longer, even the idea of continuing fades. There is no effort required, no direction to follow, only presence. If we allow that presence to deepen, even briefly, everything softens one final time. The thoughts that remain become faint. The awareness becomes light. The need to hold on to anything disappears. If we remain here, even the sense of being aware fades gently, not suddenly, not completely, but softly, as though it no longer needs to remain. If we allow that to settle, even briefly, something becomes very quiet. The ocean continues, the stillness remains, and within that stillness, everything rests. If this quiet has brought you even a small sense of ease, a slower breath, a softer moment, you can always return here. There will always be another descent, another quiet space, another place where nothing needs to happen and everything is already enough. If you'd like more journeys like this, you're always welcome to stay. But for now, there is nothing more to follow, nothing more to see, nothing more to understand. Only the quiet, and somewhere far below without needing to be noticed, something begins again.